A user story is a chunk of functionality written or told from the perspective of the user. Here's how it's different from a requirement. A requirement talks about what a system needs to do. The system shall do this, or the system shall do that. As soon as you introduce a human element into it, then you start to focus on customer delight. How is the user going to use my product? How am I going to make him happy? Right? What is his persona? Who am I targeting? So essentially a user story captures that. Now there are three critical elements to every user story. I like to call them the 3 W's. Who, what, and why. The who really represents the persona of the user or the customer. The what is the functionality. Like you said, some scope of functionality that needs to be developed. The why is the business benefit. Why are you doing it? Typical format is as a who, I want to what, so that I can, or so I can, why. Now, the who is really important because you need to understand who you're building it for so that you can build in customer delight. In addition to just an MVP or a minimum viable product. How do you continue to attract your customers? How do you gain their attention? That's what the who is about. The what is pretty simple, right? That's what you need to develop. You need to have some elaboration of that so you can code, so you can test, so you can validate it. The why is really important for prioritization. If you don't have a why and all you have is just the what and the who, and you have 10 things to do in that backlog, how do you decide if number 9 is more important than number 6? If you don't have any tangible business benefit for either of those. That's why the business benefit is important, and that's why the why is important. If you can figure out those 3 critical elements and construct that in either one sentence or multiple sentences, that's a good enough description of a user story. Now, is that enough detail to actually start coding and testing? Heck no. As a developer, I know I've had my fair share of struggles with looking at user stories and wondering, well, how the hell am I going to code this? Right? This doesn't, if I'm doing a migration from a source to a target system, if I don't have a mapping document for each of those fields, how am I going to code it? A user story is not going to have those 500 fields in it. Here's the idea. A user story is not supposed to have those things. A user story is a promise for a conversation. This is meant to start that progressive elaboration of all your content. You will come across the 3 C's for user stories. A card, conversation, and a confirmation. What that really refers to is a user story should be small enough that it describes these 3 critical elements, but can be written on a 5x7 index card. So it's not really a full-blown business specification. Conversation refers to the fact that it's a promise for a conversation. You start talking about it with your product owner. It's not the end all of that content. And confirmation refers to acceptance criteria. For those of you who've been using user stories for a while, can anybody define what an acceptance criteria is?
Completed to be considered done.
What has to be completed to consider done? Okay, to be considered done. Yes? Anybody else? Any additional thoughts? An acceptance criteria is, like you defined earlier, any kind of valid demonstrable behavior for that story to be considered done or successful. That could be in the form of a high-level test scenario. Given that a certain precondition exists, when the user does something, then a certain outcome. Or it could be as simple as test this, verify that, validate this. Now the key here is to not make that acceptance criteria completely technical. Because the product owner, who is basically from the business, has to be able to understand that. That's really what you're looking for in your acceptance criteria. Now, as I said earlier, a user story will not encapsulate all the software requirement specifications you might need for that chunk of functionality. Here's the trade-off that you make in Agile. In addition to writing those high-level test scenarios, high-level business scenarios in the acceptance criteria, you can attach supplemental documentation, which means if you need a source to target mapping document, you still need to do it. But that shouldn't hold you back from creating a user story for it and starting to code. Eventually, you will progressively elaborate that plan. And that's how you attach supplemental documentation. But the idea of creating a user story is to focus on the who, what, and why and start that conversation early. So you can start gathering requirements early, so that you can start coding early, so that you can start testing early. And as you go along, you do just-in-time documentation. That's barely good enough for you to get to the next stage. and you create those short feedback loops. That's what Agile is all about, and that's why user stories are so important. Now, user stories also are not part of Scrum. They come from extreme programming. There's a gentleman by the name Bill Wake who came up with a criterion called the INVEST criterion, which started to be used as a guidepost for what an effective or a good user story looks like. And the INVEST acronym stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. Essentially, these are all characteristics of what makes a good user story. Independent, for instance, describes that a user story should be small enough that it can be done in a sprint or less, but at the same time big enough that it can independently deliver some business value. Which means you don't want to create user stories that have inherent dependencies across each other. Because if that's the case, then unless you finish all of that cluster, you don't get credit because you don't implement anything. An easy way of looking at it is, think of a multi-layer chocolate cake. Everybody likes chocolate cake here, right? So you've got the icing up top, you've got the cake, and you've got the crust at the bottom. Everybody loves the icing, nobody loves the crust at the bottom, right? But in order to get that wholesome taste and not send a shockwave to your brain, you got to eat a good mix of all the three of them. So instead of taking a layer of the cake, you take a slice of the cake. And imagine if you're at a party and somebody just takes the entire icing away. That person is not really a good person, right? So you want to take a slice of the cake as opposed to a layer. So think of it like that. If you're thinking of a web-based product or a customer-focused e-commerce website, they have a front end, they have a middleware, and they have a back end. Those are three layers of the same cake. Now, if you only develop the front end for 6 months, and then after 6 months you come and show that the customer that, hey, we've got this pretty front end, but we have no middleware or back end to support it, do you think he's going to be happy about it? No. But after 6 months you come back and say, hey, we've got this little bit of front end, little bit of back end, little bit of middleware, and we can show you working software. He's probably going to be a little more impressed. Now, instead of 6 months, you might want to do that in a few weeks and show him a small chunk and then replicate the same process. So that's the idea of independent. Negotiable refers to the fact that everything is up for negotiation until you get to the sprint. Once you get inside the sprint, it's scope locked down. You don't change it. But until you get to the sprint, as you're doing your refinement of the backlog, you continue to negotiate with your product owner, with your customers about what the context of the story is and how much detail you want in it. Valuable. It has to be valuable, right? It has to be business value. Which means you have to figure out what the critical blocks are. You have to know who the who is, the what and the why, and more importantly, the who and the why. That's the value. Estimable, again, refers to the fact that it has to be small enough that you can estimate it. If it's too big, you can't estimate it. You don't know if you can get it done in a couple of weeks or not. Small drives home the same thing. Keep it small, keep it specific. Because when we get into estimation, we'll talk about relative estimation and how we're not doing absolute estimation. So if you're not doing absolute estimation, it has to be something small that you can relatively estimate accurately. Testable refers to the fact that you have to have testable acceptance criteria, which means your acceptance criteria really is the heart of the user story. That is what makes it more tangible to the user, to the customer. That's what makes it more testable. Any questions so far?
Step one, continuing with your data migration, data mapping example, because I haven't run into this yet, I think I'm going to. If the business identifies, let's say the business gets a story written or put in the backlog around the need to convert customer master data. Let's just pick the piece of data, right? So as the data owner, right, they want to migrate the customer master data so they don't have to re-enter it all, so they can continue the customer experience. So they've written a pretty high level story from the business point of view. Then would you expect then that when the team, someone from the team pulls that card, then they may need to write one or more stories at a lower level that talks about the specific sources that need to be mapped, and then create a mapping document that you mentioned?
If the work that goes into migrating those specific sources from whatever sources of data they are, if that's significant enough that it's more than a couple of weeks, then what you're looking at is probably a feature, and you might want to break that down into source system specific stories. If that's not the case, then I would expect that the product owner at least identify what kind of data is coming from which source systems and lay that on the acceptance criteria, saying that test that XYZ comes in from XYZ system, or validate that this comes in from that source system. It depends on how big or small it is, but it could go either way.
And then the linkage to the mapping document, would that get linked into the one or more user stories
So the mapping document might, exactly. So the mapping document or the high-level design or the low-level design document, that sort of stuff could be a supplemental artifact that goes with the user story. And the team would start working on that depending on how much bandwidth, how much capacity they have in the refinement sessions. But at least now they have a realization that we need that stuff. So when they get into the sprint, they can start with that.